Hello and welcome. Today I wanted to do a video on weathering 3D printed costume pieces. Now these are a couple of pieces that I have weathered right here. This is a gauntlet and a helmet. But I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about it because a good weathering job can really make the difference between a costume that's just okay and looks like a costume and a costume that looks like it walked straight out of a movie. So I'm not an expert on weathering by any means, but I have had pretty decent success lately and I have made a few pieces. So I figured I'd share what I know and help you guys a little bit with my process for weathering. So first off, why do we weather? Well, this is a piece of PLA material that came straight off of a 3D printer. This is a piece of torso armor for Mandalorian armor. Now, you notice all of these lines and ridges in this? Okay, so if you're wearing something for Halloween, if you're taking something to a convention center, if you don't mind people being able to see how you made it, these 3D lines are not necessarily a deal breaker. I mean, this is a decent piece of armor, and if I painted this, it would look okay. Here I have a helmet that had no finishing or weathering. I didn't even sand it. I just took it straight off the 3D printer and I printed it with textured paint, which actually filled in some of the lines a little bit. But you can still see some of that grid work. You can see the lines. You can actually hear it if I run my nail over it. So these 3D printed lines, while this looks pretty good, it does not look like it just walked off of the screen. And with a bit of work and some weathering, you end up with a product that looks like it's been through hell and looks like it's realistic, not made of plastic, that's going to pass mustard with a lot of costume organizations that are out there that pride themselves on authenticity. And worst case scenario, and even on a bare bones scenario, is really going to turn eyes if you wear it out and about on Halloween or to a convention. All right, so let me talk to you about the process. Like I said, this is a raw piece of 3D printed armor right here, taken straight off of the printer. The first thing that you need to do to this is sand the crap out of it. Now, I recommend that you don't be gentle with the sanding. I use a 60 grit most of the time. Most of the sanding, you want to try to keep going the opposite direction of the lines. So since the lines are going this way, I would be sanding this one this way. All right, here's a shoulder piece that I printed as well. The only difference between this one and this one is that this has been sanded using that 60 grit. Now it looks all scuffed up and roughed up, and you can still see some of the lines here. We're going to deal with that a little bit later, but this gives me a good base to work with in terms of getting a good finish on it and getting some good weathering on it. So the first thing that we do is we take the 60 grit sandpaper to it, and we just sand the crap out of the whole thing. Okay, the next thing that you might want to do at this stage, if you have a mind to, and this is completely optional, is you can create dents or scuffs in it that are going to be deep damage. Now, I use a roto tool for this, like a Dremel, basically. I use a barrel sanding bit on it, but you can see right here is one such mark. This mark was not in the printing process. I made this mark by basically holding a Dremel tool up to it and creating a dent. Okay, I'm going to bring this out later with the paint job. Up here towards the top, anywhere that you're printing flat with a 3D printer, you're going to end up with a lot more lines, and those lines are going to be deeper and harder to get out. So I recommend where you have the worst 3D printing lines, you might want to hit it with a Dremel tool there as well, and then sand it with the 60-bit or the 60 grit. These are also good spots for creating some of that damage. So this right here was originally a print line. Okay, I Dremeled over it, I sanded over it, and then I actually went back in with the Dremel and turned it into a damage or scuff mark or dent. Okay, again, I'm going to be setting those off a little bit later. So some of this I'm going to hide, some of this I'm going to disguise. All right, so first step, 60 grit sandpaper and Dremel tool damage if you want. For the next step, we're going to start getting a little bit fancy with things and bring in some chemicals. All right, so what I have right here is a really used tube of glaze and spot putty from Bondo. Now, Bondo in the costume community, a lot of people use Bondo for a lot of different things, and they make a ton of products. But this glaze spot putty is a very noxious, terrible smelling stuff. Use gloves when you're working with it. Use 2 pairs of gloves. Layer your gloves, because this stuff will actually, as you're rubbing this onto material, it'll eat through your glove. So use 2 sets of gloves, and basically what you're going to do is you squeeze this stuff onto your sanded material like this, and you rub it in as thin as you can with your finger. If you have deep lines, like up here, there's going to be some deep lines because I actually had to repair this print. I ran out of filament here, and the print failed, so I printed this and added it to the top. So I've got to go thicker here because there is some damage, but thin anywhere that there isn't. And basically you just use your finger with the gloves and you smear this stuff on. So here is a tacit plate that I have actually added this sort of this Bondo spot glaze to, and just rubbed it down and rubbed it into all of the cracks and holes where I want it to be. All right. When it dries, this stuff basically turns into clay. So it's easy to sand, it's easy to work with. It's actually, be careful because it's actually water soluble. So after it gets all dry, if you get it wet again, it's going to turn into mud and it's going to be unworkable. So get it on there and then let it dry for probably about a day. This piece is not entirely dry, so you see how some of these areas are darker than others. If I tried to sand this right now, it would just ball up and come off. So you got to have patience with this. Give it about a day to dry, and then you're going to be able to work with it. So after it has had a chance to dry appropriately, then I recommend going back with either 100 or 120 grit sandpaper on a sanding block, because you want to make this as flat as you possibly can. If you're dealing with corners or edges or those places where you put in the dents, then come in with a piece of sandpaper, not on a block, just on your thumb, and work it in. But after it's dried, you sand it off, and it sands really easily, and you end up with a flat surface a lot more like this. Okay, you can still see some of the lines and the paint through this, because this was an already painted piece that I went over again. But when we prime this, it's going to look a lot more smooth than it does right now. All right, so we come back in, we sand with the 100 to 120 grit, and you sand until you can almost see, or in places see, your original material through the Bondo. So you want to get most of the Bondo off, you're just using it to level. If you end up getting cracks or you sand too much off, if you put the Bondo on too quick or too thickly, then it'll crack. Then you need to go back in with another thin cover of Bondo over that, sand it off, re-Bondo, do it again, and eventually you'll get it. If you're working with a painted surface, that's much more common. But eventually, get enough of the Bondo on there, get it sanded off, until you end up with a smooth surface. And now it's time to prime.